I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program of the New America Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us today. And what's a very interesting set of poll results. I want to take a moment and credit my Deputy Director, Patrick Doherty. I don't know if Patrick's even in the room. This is really his program. He's done such a great job behind the scenes organizing today's event, helping to orchestrate an important op-ed that went up on CNN's website about 2 minutes ago, co-authored by our own Amjad Atallah, who directs our Middle East Task Force, and Ken Ballin of Terror Free Tomorrow. The poll results today of Terror Free Tomorrow and the New America Foundation are an important, we're done in May, but are an important snapshot of thinking inside Iran. And I'm going to let Ken, lay out all the why this is so distinctive beyond, the obvious question of how do you poll in Iran. But this is a snapshot of what's going on there, of course, just before the important elections that have so many people focused on them on June 12th, this Friday. And a couple of takeaways from this report here, which we have now posted online. There are a couple of hundred people watching live over the New America Foundation's website and over the Washington Note blog. I just posted this report on my blog, so those of you who are watching online can go and download the very large report. It's 70 pages long, but flip through with us. This is the executive summary that we're handing out to folks today. And to talk about it, we have an excellent panel. First to my right is Kenneth Ballin. He is president of Terror Free Tomorrow. He spent more than 20 years on the front lines in law enforcement, international relations, intelligence oversight, and congressional investigations. He has served as counsel to the House Iran-Contra Committee under Chairman Lee Hamilton, served as chief counsel to a bipartisan Senate Special Investigative Committee with Senator John McCain. In a long, convoluted story many years ago, Ken Ballin, who was you were chief of staff or chief investigator for Henry Waxman on the during the Clinton administration's campaign finance hearings. And everybody wants to go back to my dark past. I had a moment of being involved in some of that where I was supposedly a friendly witness to the Republican committee. I wasn't so friendly, actually. And Ken probably saved my political career by helping me to navigate through those shoals of something that was fun. And I owe him forever for that. So I'm here today because of Ken Ballin. And then we have Azadeh Pourzound, a candidate for Masters in Public Policy in International Global Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. She worked as a teaching fellow at the Center for Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Harvard, assisted our own Afshin Malavi of the New America Foundation in studying the Iranian alternative media's reaction to the Obama presidency in the United States. And Azadeh is going to be here to help lay out the human dimensions of the polling results that Ken Ballin and his team have produced. And then we have Flint Leverett. Flint is the director of the Geopolitics of Energy Initiative at the New America Foundation, also director of the New America Foundation's New Iran Project as part of our Carnegie Corporation-supported Great Powers Initiative. He is a great friend, of course, a former staff member and senior director for the Middle East of the National Security Council, a former Middle East expert at the State Department, and we always like to mention that he was at the CIA. Very important because he's been doing incredible yeoman's work in bringing a lot of that work that he's done in the past into the public spotlight, and occasionally wrestling, particularly during the Bush administration, with the CIA Publication Review Board over this. And Flint has some very important op-eds with his wife, Hillary Mann Leverett, that have recently run about Iran and the Obama administration's, what he would call kind of, to some way, tripping and hiccups in the Iran policy. Maybe even he would go far worse than that, but at least raising some big questions about the Obama administration's policy. So let me invite Ken Ballin to help set the stage. I'll ask Azadeh to go next, and then Flint, and then I will be up here to work with all of you in kicking the tires of this report. But Ken Ballin, please give him a round of applause.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your kind remarks. I think you overstated my contribution to your career. It's been successful way on its own. So anyway, thank you for the kind remarks. Thank you to New America for hosting this event and also collaborating with us on this poll. I think the thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about this poll is polling in Iran is not like polling in the United States. It's not something you can do with ease. It's not something that happens every day. We can't run in right before the elections and get a kind of a temperature that we would normally do in the United States. It is a closed society. It is an authoritarian government. And most polling there is monitored by the government. So when you read about a poll coming out of Iran, ask whether it's an independent poll, ask whether it's uncensored, or ask whether it's covered by the Iranian government in one form or another. If it is, I would greet those results with skepticism. Our poll, when it was taken, shows that the incumbent President Ahmadinejad is in the lead. But more importantly, perhaps, than that, what it shows is that the Iranian people are very far removed from the stereotypes that are commonly asserted in the United States and the West about them. They want a democratic future. They want a free press. They want open elections. They want to be able to choose in a democratic vote their supreme leader. And these hold regardless of whether they're supporting President Ahmadinejad or not. So there is no mandate here for belligerence. There is a mandate for better relations with the United States. This is our third nationwide poll in Iran in the last 3 years. So these findings have remained consistent from poll to poll. Let me begin with a PowerPoint, and we'll go through this. First of all, I urge you to consult the full poll results online. And we have the methodology laid out online in great detail and in a quite transparent fashion, actually. This is a telephone poll of Iran. Telephones are, it's a modern society, and telephone penetration in Iran is plus 90%. I'm sure you can't read this, but on our website it's laid out, and you can go to the Washington Note or New America and get the same results. The horse race. Our poll shows, when it was taken in May, when the campaign began, that President Ahmadinejad is in the lead with 34%, followed by 14% for his closest rival, Mir Hossein Mousavi. 27% in our poll said they don't know. Of that 27%, 60% of those, more than 60% in fact, are people who want reform of the Iranian political system. So I would say that these results probably overstate President Ahmadinejad's lead, that it's probably a lot closer because a significant portion of the don't knows may go into the Mir Hossein Mousavi or possibly even Mehdi Karabi's camp. Now, in the Iranian system is such that if no one breaks the 50% barrier, there's a runoff between the two top contenders. Indeed, this is what happened in the last Iranian presidential election in 2004, when Rafsanjani and Ahmadinejad ran in a runoff. Given the sizable don't knows in this, that we would think that probably a runoff will be likely. The other thing to point out is that no incumbent president has ever lost re-election in the Iranian Islamic Republic since it was formed. So that is something to remember.
Can I just ask clarifying about there's a missing 22% on this chart.
There's 15% refused to answer this question.
Okay.
So that's the missing number. We did an analysis of those who refused, and they broke almost evenly between regime supporters and regime opponents, broadly speaking. But the don't knows, 27%, did not break that way. 60% broke. From other questions, we would put them in the reformist camp. But that doesn't mean they'll vote. I mean, they may be, that we can't measure, and that's why we can't.
It's good to know. I just wondered if there were just an endless line of other.
No, that's it. The other thing that's interesting from a sociological point of view is that Mr. Mousavi has tried to draw attention to his Azeri background. Azeris are the largest ethnic group besides Persians in Iran. They're about 20% or so of the population. Anyway, he's run on this and tried to draw support from his ethnic identification. In our poll, that's not working. We found that only 16% of Azeri Iranians said they would vote for Mr. Mousavi, as opposed to 31% who said they would vote for Mr. Ahmadinejad. Iranians are fairly positive about the elections. 89%, this is not on the slide, said they will cast a vote. Compare that with our percentage in the United States, that's quite high. About 7 in 10 Iranians said they think the election will be free and fair. Only 1 in 10 said they thought it would not be free and fair. And most, as you see from this chart, are satisfied with the choices that they've been offered. Very significantly, 77% of Iranians said they favor a system of government where they can vote for the supreme leader and all leaders. The supreme leader is the one with the ultimate power in Iran. And the Iranian people realize that because we asked them about that, and I'll get to that later. But only 18% oppose the current system of government in Iran where they cannot vote for the most powerful official in the country. So almost 8 in 10 Iranians want to hold the most powerful official in their country accountable to the voters. And he is not held accountable now. What does that tell you? It tells you that the priorities that the Iranian people have, the economy is number one, unsurprisingly so. But look at this, much more interesting. Ensuring free elections, ensuring free press are virtually identical in numbers. I wouldn't draw any conclusions from the couple of percentage points that separate it. The top 3 priorities Iranians have, ensuring free elections, ensuring free press, are almost as much as the economy itself. That tells you that the hunger for a more democratic system in Iran extends to all Iranians, whether they support Ahmadinejad, they do not support him, whatever their stripe is. They are hungry for a more democratic system. They are also hungry for Western investment and humanitarian assistance to Iran. Now, clearly the issue of foreign investment is important to the Iranian people. It is also important to the Iranian government. Right now there's a bill before the parliament to significantly improve the legal protection afforded to foreign investment in Iran. And we'll get to this later, but among all the steps the United States can take to improve its standing among the Iranian people, free trade is number one. And in this context, nuclear weapons are not terribly important. We saw in the prior chart of priorities that among the list we gave Iranians, came in last. Less than half the people chose that as a priority. They still favor nuclear weapons by a majority, 52% and 40% oppose. Nuclear energy is off the table. Everyone in Iran wants it, and it rings very high. So I think that the public is very much behind a nuclear energy program. How do Iranians respond if you offer them a deal, or what's been called the Brand bargain, in return for not developing nuclear weapons? Well, they're overwhelmingly, we skipped ahead. They're overwhelmingly in favor of it. They're overwhelmingly, more than 7 in 10 Iranians would favor some kind of trade-off for full inspection and a guarantee to ensure no nuclear weapons. That's not nuclear energy, it's weapons. So the desire for reaching to the outside is very strong, and that extends to the United States. Almost 8 in 10 Iranians want full and normal trade and recognition between the United States. Only 15% oppose. 90% want U.S. assistance with peaceful nuclear energy. Only 6% oppose. Maybe that 6% is your die-hard anti-American no matter what happens. They want nothing to do with the United States. Very small number. Similarly, they favor the United States working with the Iranian government, or the Iranian government working with the United States to help resolve the Iraq War, and by a slightly lesser percentage, but not full and unconditional negotiations between the Iranian and American governments. Again, we'll get to this later on, but as part of negotiations, Iranians would support recognizing both Israel and a Palestinian state, and ending Iranian support for armed groups, armed militias in Iran. Now, this is very interesting on the economy of Iran. from our survey a year ago, and all the findings we talked about are consistent with our past work, but from our survey a year ago, a little more than a year ago, 42% of the Iranians thought the economy was headed in the right direction. That has now dropped to 33%. But Iranians do not hold Ahmadinejad responsible for the deteriorating economy. 46% of Iranians think his policies have succeeded in reducing unemployment and inflation, and that's slightly up from last time, even though they think the economy is headed in the wrong direction. That's why I think showed him ahead in the polls. They're not, for whatever reasons, they're not holding him responsible. On Israel, most Iranians, which is consistent with public opinion in the region, oppose any peace treaty recognizing Israel in favor of a very militant stance. Only 20% favor a peace treaty if an independent Palestinian state is established. These numbers do change, though, as part of an agreement with the United States. So it indicates a priority and the importance that Iranians place on an agreement with the United States. Similarly, Iranians now support the Iranian government providing military and financial aid to Palestinian opposition groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And this extends even among poor Iranians right through. Every income group in Iran supports this, and this has also been a consistent finding over the past 2 years in all our surveys in Iran. I alluded to this earlier. What would improve your opinion of the United States? Free trade treaty between the United States and Iran is number one. Withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, increasing visas for Iranians to come and study and work in the United States, and U.S. reopening its embassy in Tehran and engaging in negotiations. What would not improve opinion is, even though the Iranians desperately want more democracy, they do not want the United States working to spread democracy inside Iran. Nor does brokering a peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians help their opinion of the United States, absent some kind of Iranian-American agreement. In many ways, I find this the most interesting part of the poll because, what I'm about to talk about, because it's so different from other countries in the region. Iranians are very open and accepting of outsiders. You see their views are largely favorable on Chinese, Arabs, Turks, Americans, and French. Look, we're tied with the French. How about that? It's the only country I know of where we're tied with the French. Not even in France are we tied with the French. Anyway, you can see where Americans, despite the fact that less than a third of Iranians now have a favorable view of the United States itself, it's not true when it comes to Americans. In fact, they're as favorable towards Americans, forget about the French for a minute, they're as favorable towards Americans as they are towards their Arab neighbors, which is pretty extraordinary and absolutely unique for that region. And I don't know of any other country where that is. This is also quite interesting, their views of other religions and sects. As you know, the Iranian population is 90 plus, or almost 90 plus % Shiite Muslims. Yet they have very favorable views of Sunnis. So what does that tell us about the so-called, Sunni Shiite divide and all of that? It tells us it's not coming from the Iranian people at all, because their views of Sunni Muslims are significantly higher than their views of Arabs. So whatever problems they're having or consider between Arabs and Iranians, it's not because of the sectarian identification at all. This is not true on the other side. Look at Jews and favorable, unfavorable. Our chart is a little off in terms of scaling there, but it's 40% are favorable, 32%. You know what the number of favorable opinion towards Jews is in Saudi Arabia, where we polled? It's like 6 or 7%. We couldn't even measure it. It was so small. This is not true in Iran. So while they're opposed to Israel and opposed to the policies of Israel, the Iranian people make a very sophisticated distinction that I dare say many in the United States don't make, between the policies of a government and the people, between Jews as a people and between the policies of the State of Israel. It's rather remarkable, and it shows that people that is fairly sophisticated. And we do a nationwide poll in rural areas. You know, close 18% of the people who polled are illiterate. I mean, this is to me fairly impressive stuff. Just a couple more slides to wrap it up. Iranians see their greatest threat as being from Israel and the United States, and nobody else registered, basically. And their second greatest threat, same deal, and nobody else yet. While they see the United States as their and Israel as their greatest threat, they also see the United States as their potential greatest ally, and that's what's interesting. This is to be expected, frankly, but the other side of it is less expected. They have a pretty good sense of who holds power in their government, because we asked them to rate various entities, and we asked them what the extent of the president's power was in Iran. They got it right. So this is a population that, if you put it in the context, if you're just reading this poll result, or you just think of it as an American-type poll, I think you're missing the larger picture, because the vision of the Iranian people for a more democratic future, with normal trade and relations, is the consensus now over our polls for 2 years. And even if they support President Ahmadinejad, does not mean they don't support these goals. So if he is reelected, it's not on the mandate of the policies he's been carrying out heretofore. It's on a new mandate. If he's listening to what the people want, whether they support him or not, it's change.
Just handed the AP story of the release of the report, so that's good. Now we have, if you'll join us. Great.
Thanks for having me here. And so I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a context about some of the facts that I personally found striking when I looked at the recent poll by the New America Foundation and the Terror Free Tomorrow. Well, one of the things that I personally found pretty striking was the first line, which is that Ahmadinejad is leading in the current elections. And I had to think about it a little bit, because following the media, the Iranian media and the blogs, and seeing all sorts of YouTube videos and Facebook, it was pretty striking to me that statistically speaking, we are seeing that Ahmadinejad is leading. And I think I came to the conclusion that, while that might be true, we have to pay close attention to the population that say that they are undecided. And we also have to be careful in thinking whether or not Ahmadinejad is the bottom or the top dominant of this whole spectrum. Meaning that, well, we definitely know from the polls that he doesn't have the 50% of the vote, which means that most probably the elections would go to the second round. But also that I think it was 15 or 17% that is undecided could make a significant difference in the upcoming elections. And so I just wanted to point out 2 or 3 facts about the political system in Iran that might also play a role in the results. One is that, as you probably know, there is no real official political party in Iran, which really agitates sort of the process of voting and the process of making a decision as a voter about to whom you're going to vote. And that is pretty significant, I think, because even when I lived in Iran during Khatami's elections and presidency, you would see that for the beginning of the campaigns, and as the candidates would nominate themselves and would get selected by the Guardian Council, no one really knew who exactly they would want to vote for. Maybe they knew who they wouldn't want to vote for, but it would sort of remain like a doubtful question in people's minds about who exactly is their candidates. And because there wasn't enough talk about specific policies about each candidate, and also a lot of people thought that they didn't have a real candidate, because the candidates have to go through the selection by the Guardian Council, and so many get rejected. And that's pretty important, I think, because because in the past few days even, I think that there might have been some changes. There is a real buzz now, especially after the debates, the official debates that we've been seeing between Ahmadinejad and Karoubi and Mousavi, and Ahmadinejad and I think Mousavi. It's pretty striking that for the first time officially on the governmental TV, these candidates are discussing their policies, and they're not very nice to each other, and sometimes when you really just listen to those debates, you hear a much harsher sort of literature than you would even read or hear in the West, and I think that's pretty significant. And another thing is that given that in the poll it shows that about 1/3 of the people have access to the internet one way or another, while the percentage might not be high to us, it's still high enough to create some sort of alternative debate, if you will. And also that the population of Iran is pretty young. So if you follow what goes on among the youth in Iran, you will really see a very high energy about a lot of younger people on the reformist side trying to make statements about how they want change, and they have definitely learned from the Obama's campaign, I think. So we hear change all the time, and there's definitely the use of color. We have green for Mousavi, and then Ahmadinejad's fans wear the Iranian flag on the street, and then they debate on the street. So you definitely see things like that are pretty striking and new. And also that they make a lot of video clips, and they put it on YouTube and all sorts of other websites. And but it's not just the reformist youth that they do it. I mean, you see it on the conservative side as well, and it's a very unique form of dialogue that is happening. If you read the blogs, you will definitely see a very interesting kind of literature where, as Ken mentioned, and the polls also show that despite the fact that Iranians might be scattered in their political views, you definitely see a certain kind of unity about certain preferences that they have. The economic situation is certainly number one, and then immediately it follows all their desire for all sorts of different freedoms: social freedom, freedom of expression, political freedoms. The way they talk about it and their definitions of it might be different, but they definitely raise issues of such. And for instance, I'll just give you an example. In the more conservative blogs or media, when you read, you definitely see the desire for, say, social freedoms. But then you also see the urgency that they raise about how we should not confuse the social freedoms with westernization and with basically the morally corrupt culture. And that's why they said we need the agents, the authorities, to help us have a sort of freedom that is very unique to the Islamic Republic, but that is not mimicking the West. On the other hand, you definitely see a lot of rhetoric about how during Ahmadinejad, the more reformists or the more liberals have had literally no say in politics, and one of the other things that get very criticized is the fact that Ahmadinejad started a project called the Social Safety Project or the Social Health Project, which was an additional layer to the moral police system that we have in Iran, which was basically with the mission was to sort of secure the public spaces of Iran from westernization and create safety for everyone, which resulted in certain extent of violence with against youth and women on the streets. So you hear a lot of critics of Ahmadinejad talking about that and saying that we're even losing our social freedoms. And so these are some of the things that I have seen that I try to put in the context of the polls and the results that I have seen, and most of them, for the most part, I definitely think that they match. And it's while there are some sobering factors and not necessarily what we hear in the West, but they're definitely true. And I think that there is hope, but that we really have to be careful about how we analyze elections in Iran. Like, for instance, in the last elections, many people who were on the more reformist sides were completely disappointed after the results because they were certain that Dr. Moin was going to win without really paying attention to what was going on really outside elite Tehran and in the provinces and with all these different ethnicities. And so even Iranians, I think, failed to assess what was going on within their own countries. So I think this is pretty unique that we are assessing the different possibilities and, you know, some of them sobering possibilities that might happen. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Azadeh. We'll be back to you. And now Flint Leverett.
Thank you. I don't want to spend too much time on the electoral handicapping aspect of the poll, but I did want to say a couple of things on that front. As Ken pointed out, the suggestion in the polling data that Ahmadinejad is in a potentially strong position to win re-election is certainly consistent with the history of the Islamic Republic. No incumbent president has been defeated for re-election. I think it's also, to some degree, consistent with some structural realities about Iranian politics. An Iranian scholar whose work I admire quite a bit, Farida Fardeh, she argues that Ahmadinejad probably has a reliable block of roughly 12 million votes that he can count on to show up on election day. At least one advisor to the Mousavi campaign has been quoted in the press as saying that he thinks that block, which Ahmadinejad can count on, may be as large as 14 million people. If you assume that it is as large as 14 million people, and you assume a 60% turnout rate, which would be roughly the turnout rate for the second round of the 2005 election, 14 million votes would put Ahmadinejad just barely over the 50% mark in the first round. That being said, we're obviously seeing a lot of anecdotal reporting about what at least Western reporters are perceiving to be a surge in support for Mousavi in the late stages of the campaign. And like a lot of elections in the United States, it would seem the turnout is going to be a critical factor. You know, it would seem as if even with a relatively high turnout, 60%, Ahmadinejad is in a strong position. If you get turnout higher than that, presumably that works to the benefit of his challengers, in particular, Mr. Mousavi. So I go over those points in part to make a bigger point, which is that we really don't know who's going to win an Iranian presidential election until they actually have it. And I think in many instances, the supreme leader doesn't know who's going to win an Iranian presidential election until they have it. And it is remarkable to think about the number of states that figure very prominently in American foreign policy for whom that you couldn't make that statement. Since the Soviet Union broke up and Russia emerged as an ostensible democracy, when is the last time that a Russian presidential election, the outcome was ever seriously in doubt, that we couldn't have said months before with considerable confidence who the winner would be? But we can't do that with Iranian elections. And I think that says something very interesting about the state of the Islamic Republic. The bigger point I wanted to make, though, is that however the election comes out, whether Ahmadinejad is reelected or whether the Mousavi challenge succeeds in unseating him, in terms of policy issues that matter to the United States, I frankly don't think the outcome of this presidential election matters all that much. Iranian foreign policy, especially foreign policy on the core issues of national security for the Islamic Republic, are rooted in, I think, a very deeply held elite consensus that cuts across much of the factional spectrum in the Islamic Republic's politics. And what Ken's poll would suggest is that this elite consensus about national security is actually quite strongly backed by Iranian public opinion. What is that consensus? Well, I think in the post-Khomeini period in particular, there is a consensus among Iranian elites about the national security challenges that Iran faces and the ways in which Iran needs to try to cope with those challenges. I've had Iranian officials, diplomats, national security officials, others, explain it to me like this. Iran has 15 states on its borders. 15. There is not a natural ally among them. And in fact, a number of Iran's neighbors have had hostile relations with Iran, and some, as in the case of Iraq, have actually been the platform for serious armed aggression against Iran in recent years. So Iran has no strategic depth in the way that strategists usually think about strategic depth. And it has no meaningful conventional military capabilities. Iran cannot project any significant measure of conventional military power beyond its borders. It is simply not able to do that. And so Iranian elites have developed a national security strategy, a national security doctrine that emphasizes at least two things. One is the pursuit of, let's call it, asymmetric military capabilities. Certainly, I think Iranian missile programs fall into this category. You could also argue, depending on what you want to believe about the ultimate goal of Iran's nuclear program, that the nuclear program falls under that category, in that even if it is simply creating a perceived option for Iran to have nuclear weapons, that has to have an impact on the strategic calculations of Iran's neighbors. So that's one way in which Iran tries to cope with its national security challenges. The other way is by developing connections to proxy actors in neighboring states, other important states in the region, so that Iran has levers that it can use to ensure that these states don't become platforms for aggression or pressure against Iranian interests. Now, I understand from the perception of others in the region and from the perception of the United States, these aspects of Iran's national security strategy can seem threatening, indeed offensive in nature. But from an Iranian perspective, I am deeply persuaded that these aspects of Iran's national security strategy are fundamentally defensive in nature. And what you have is a very good example of what students of international relations like to call a security dilemma. That the steps which one state takes to provide for its own defense appear threatening and offensive to other states. But this is the essence of Iran's national security strategy. It has been the essence of that strategy under President Rafsanjani. It was the essence of Iranian strategy under President Khatami. It has been the essence of Iranian strategy under President Ahmadinejad. And whether or not President Ahmadinejad wins re-election or is replaced by someone else, it will continue to be the essence of Iran's national security strategy. Now, linked to that is an openness on the part of Iran to the possibility of strategic rapprochement, particularly with the United States, as a way of addressing its core security and foreign policy interests. And I think if you look at the tenure of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, what you have seen since he became the supreme leader following Khomeini's death is that this is a man who is very skeptical about U.S. intentions toward the Islamic Republic, is not at all sure that the United States wants to have a normal relationship with the Islamic Republic. But if it were possible, if the United States were willing to have that kind of normal relationship and Iran could reach a strategic understanding with the United States that would address the Islamic Republic's core security needs, Khamenei has, and I believe would, support such a possibility. Rafsanjani's various overtures to the United States when he was president could not have taken place without the support of the supreme leader. Now, in the end, those overtures by Rafsanjani culminated in the Clinton administration issuing executive orders that imposed a comprehensive U.S. economic embargo on Iran. The immediate precipitating event for the issuance of those executive orders, the gross provocation on the part of Iran which elicited that response, was that Rafsanjani offered an American oil company, Conoco, contract to develop 2 Iranian oil fields in 1995. And in response to that, the Clinton administration issued executive orders imposing a comprehensive economic embargo on Iran. But those overtures by Rafsanjani, those and other overtures, would not have been possible without Khamenei's backing. When Khatami became president, there is, of course, all the attention paid to Khatami's initiatives with the so-called Dialogue of Civilizations. But what's really important to me in the Khatami presidency is that after the 9/11 attacks, Iran reached out to the United States and said, let us help you. Let us help you in Afghanistan. Let us help you against al-Qaeda. And Iran provided considerable assistance to the United States post 9/11 on those subjects. The Bonn Conference in December 2001, where the Karzai government was stood up, would not have succeeded without Iran's cooperation. Their reward for that 6 weeks later was to be labeled part of the axis of evil in President Bush's January 2002 State of the Union address. And Iranian officials have told me that the reason the Iranian government did that was because they calculated that if Iran could be seen in the United States as helping America respond to the terrible blow of the 9/11 attacks, it would prompt the United States to rethink its own position toward the Islamic Republic. What can I say? The Iranians were dealing with the Bush administration, and that assumption was ultimately unfounded. But that was the assumption that they made. Even Ahmadinejad, since he has become president, for all his rhetoric that grates on American sensibilities, he has indicated on multiple occasions that if the United States were prepared to deal with the Islamic Republic on an appropriate basis, in an atmosphere of respect, that he is open to a strategic dialogue with the United States. And that aspect of Iranian policy is not going to change either, whether Ahmadinejad wins re-election or whether he's replaced by someone else. But what Ken's polls underscore is that what Iranians want from the United States is a real deal. They want a deal that addresses their, not just helps them economically, but addresses their fundamental security needs. And as part of that kind of strategic opening to the United States, they are willing to support international guarantees, measures that would assure that Iran's civil nuclear program is not being used as a basis for a nuclear weapons program. They are prepared to modify the kinds of relationships they have with groups like Hamas in the Palestinian context. They're not going to sever those relationships, but they are prepared to modify them, to manage them in different ways as part of a strategic understanding with the United States. Now, the issue I think that this poses for the United States is that simply saying you want to engage, simply saying you want to talk, is not going to be enough. If Mousavi wins, the basic requirements of the Iranian side for real strategic progress will be the same. And if Ahmadinejad wins, the possibility for a strategic opening with Iran by the United States will be the same. The issue is not having a meeting, having diplomatic exchanges, and it's not who the other guy is on the other side. It's a question of what the United States is going to put on the table. And are we prepared for a real strategic, broad-based understanding with the Islamic Republic of Iran, what I've called a grand bargain? If the United States is not prepared for that, I don't care who wins this election, whatever kind of diplomatic engagement the Obama administration comes up with is not going to produce very much. If the United States is prepared to go down that road of comprehensive strategic engagement, then I think even with a re-elected President Ahmadinejad, a grand bargain is eminently doable. I also just want to say in closing, I hate with a passion references to how Iranian politics is too messed up, too conflicted for them to be able to do a deal with the United States. Every time the United States has engaged in serious issue-specific diplomacy with Iran, the people they have sent have been empowered, knowledgeable, and able to deal. If there is not a consensus behind engaging the United States, a consensus in Tehran, they will not send people. You will not have engagement. But if you have engagement, that's because there is a consensus in Tehran, and we will not have a hard time finding serious and empowered interlocutors to deal with. And anybody who tells you otherwise doesn't know anything about Iranian foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I'm always wowed listening to Flint. I'm going to come to you in a little bit. I want to open up to the floor in a moment. But Flint, I want you to share what you really think about Dennis Ross before the time is out. It was a joke. Ken, the Associated Press has put out a long piece here, just as we were putting on the program 15 minutes ago. And the takeaway from the top of it is that few Iranians see the United States favorably, despite Obama. And it starts out with the sort of most negative readings of the poll. And I'm wondering what you think. Is that the right takeaway, or are there other takeaways that AP should have led with?
It's clearly the wrong takeaway. I mean, you know, the AP. I'm sorry. It's clearly the wrong. Thank you, Steve. It's clearly the wrong takeaway because what the AP fails to do is put the poll in context. They say that just 29% of Iranians have favorable views of the United States. Well, we talked about that. Go in the region. That's actually high. And it totally neglects the fact that for Americans, almost half have a favorable view. More importantly, they say the headline of the piece is few Iranians see U.S. favorably despite Obama. Well, we don't ask about President Obama in the poll, so I don't know how they draw that conclusion that despite Obama, few Iranians see U.S. favorably. Look, what's important is 90%, 91% to be precise, of Iranians get their news from state television. I don't even know whether Obama's outreach to Iran has been covered on state television. So to draw the conclusion that that kind of outreach hasn't had an impact, I think is not a very careful reading of the poll.
Let me ask Azadeh and Flint just for a quick response on something. It seems to me, reading through the poll as I have quickly done now, in terms of, and then also looking at the data you have, that in contrast to what Flint said, that there's fundamentally not a difference between the two candidates per se when it comes to the strategic issues. There may be a difference between the two candidates in the minds of Iranians who are picking things. And you might, given the aspirations they have, which I think Flint articulated very well on terms of various freedoms that they'd like to have, engagement with the United States and whatnot, that Ahmadinejad might be called the sort of bulldog strategy. And had the Obama administration potentially moved earlier, I know this is a hypothetical, on a kind of Flint-Leverett grand bargain strategy, maybe that bulldog might have been less necessary. And I'm wondering if that would be an incorrect conclusion. Do you have any thoughts on that, Azadeh and Flint?
Well, I think that in terms of...
Can you pull the mic up?
Sorry. In terms of domestic politics, I think that I think that you're right in the sense that there are differences between these candidates. The question is whether or not they could implement these differences and different policies that they have. But on the surface of debates, you definitely hear differences that they have in terms of their policies. In terms of the U.S., most of them, I would say, they are pretty clever in the way they phrase how exactly they're going to try to have negotiations with the U.S. if that was ever an opportunity. So it's sort of difficult to know who exactly is planning to do what if the opportunity arises.
Thank you. Flint?
Yeah, I think that there are clearly some important differences among the candidates when it comes to domestic issues. On foreign policy, I would say the differences are more stylistic than substantive. Mousavi has criticized Ahmadinejad for kind of unnecessary levels of antagonism with outside powers, and has said that if he were president of Iran would be sitting down with the P5+1 and negotiating. I mean, that is, I guess, a stylistic difference, but in the end, a Mousavi administration, I would wager, is going to be no more inclined or capable of terminating Iran's enrichment program than the re-elected Ahmadinejad administration would be. And so, yeah, Ahmadinejad likes to say his bulldog approach is superior to the softer approach of his opponents, because the softer approach of his opponents led Iran to suspend its nuclear program for 2 years, and they got nothing in return. His bulldog approach has got the world beating at Iran's door, wanting to talk. But in the end, what the negotiators are going to be empowered to say will be the same.
You can't take away a mic when we're online, so okay, go ahead.
Thanks.
Okay. One last question before I go to the floor, and then I'll open everyone. I was very, very surprised in the study for the reaction about nuclear weapons, because every Iranian that I spoke to kind of carries the government line that they're not interested in nuclear weapons, that they are interested in nuclear energy. But a 52% figure that they are interested in nuclear weapons in the strategy I'm surprised the AP didn't pick that up, because that's a huge, huge change in my view in terms of it. I've also noticed on the U.S. side, we hosted the former chairman of the National Intelligence Council a couple years ago, Tom Fingar, who was largely responsible for the Iran national intelligence estimate change that at that point made the point that Iran had suspended its activities in nuclear weapons program. To my knowledge, that hasn't been reviewed, but in the Obama administration, Obama, Hillary Clinton, and everyone except the military guys pretty much talks about nuclear weapons in Iran. So the idea of nuclear weapons has come back, but I'm fascinated that you have such candid expressions by people there. Do you have any reactions to that? Because I see that as a big deal.
Well, I think the Iranian people kind of see through the rhetoric, and they see this as a nuclear weapon program.
Interesting. Well, if they do, then I guess the rest of the world isn't wrong if they do too. Thoughts, Flint?
Yeah. The official Iranian position, the elite position, the policy position, is that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Iran does not want and is not currently seeking nuclear weapons, and in fact, the religion of most Iranians, Shia Islam, would prohibit Iran from developing nuclear weapons.
So what's the unofficial reality?
I think that the unofficial reality is that the Iranians are well aware that if they have a developed fuel cycle, are capable of enriching and storing large amounts of enriched uranium, that this is a significant step toward an actual nuclear weapons capability. It will be perceived as such by outside states. And it gives Iran an option. It's, in a way, not fundamentally different from the situation of Japan today, where everyone knows if Japan took a sovereign decision to withdraw from the NPT, it could be building nuclear weapons in a very short period of time. I don't think Iran would mind being in a somewhat analogous position ultimately.
Right, I agree with that. Let me go to this gentleman here, and we'll go around to Mike Mochisuki, but yes. And if you'll identify yourself and...
Sure. I'm Alan Kieswetter with CNO Resources, and while we've been speaking here this morning, there was a poll that's quoted in Online Newsweek saying that their correspondents had seen a secret government poll that shows Ahmadinejad substantially behind, roughly 16 to 18 million votes for Mousavi, and Ahmadinejad only getting 6 to 8 million. Is this credible? And can there have been such a shift?
No.
In such a short period of time?
It's not credible. I don't find it credible. This happens, Azadeh and Flint can comment, but this happens in every election cycle. There are a lot of so-called polls, and you just, unless you see, I have a friend, a former State Department person who's very knowledgeable about polls, unless you see the methodology behind a poll, it doesn't have any meaning.
It'd be great if Ahmadinejad could then say, look at what I overcame to
Well,
win.
that's right.
Yes, Mike?
Thank you, Mike Miyazawa. I have a question for Ms. Forzand. I understand you can read blogs written in Farsi. And my question to you is, what is the reaction among the general public in Iran to the speech Obama made last week in Cairo? An Arab friend of mine last week told me immediately after Obama's address that, yes, the goals he talked about are good, but how is he going to implement those goals? He talked about goals, but he did not talk about policies. So he was still waiting to see what he's going to actually do. He's waiting for the action, not the words.
Thanks, Mike. Reaction?
Well, I briefly have browsed blogs after that speech, and the understanding that I have is that overall I saw a rather positive reaction, though there are definitely concerns and worries among different sects of bloggers and in general writers, whose writings you can have access to online, because some worry that, well, what if Obama actually wants to implement these policies, and what happens to the dynamics of the politics within Iran? So it's a domestic sort of worries, of what will happen if Obama succeeds in that. And then there are definitely others who find this as a channel of hope, but don't really go into details about the policies. And you hear a little bit about, and as far as I know, you hear a little bit about, the worries over like the specifications of the policies and how exactly these are going to be implemented. But I think, at least in the Persian media, in the Persian alternative media, the focus is more on the Iranian side rather than the American side, is in how within the Iranian side is this going to take place.
Thank you. This gentleman right here.
I'm Bob Axolby. I'm unaffiliated. I have a question actually for each. First with Flint. Just as you described kind of our understanding, a better understanding that irrelevant of which of those candidates win, there is a kind of a national security need that kind of is a current is at the core of Iran's policy decisions. Have you had conversations with elected officials or others that I guess you speak with about how their perception is regarding Obama's election? I mean, it seemed that at first they were very confused about it. Now 6-7 months has passed. Are they seeing Obama's administration kind of continuing that core American policy? Do they really see, or do they really sense that there is new possibilities? Okay. And then, real quick for Azadeh, in the last election, 2005, one of the major reasons that there was kind of a lower voter turnout was obviously people were kind of turned off by Khatami not being able to succeed. And there was a very active boycott effort, led by people like Ganji and Sazgar and all these other people. Have you seen any effort in that regard? I haven't noticed it. I thought you might notice it in the Persian media yourself. Thank you.
In terms of Iranian perceptions of Obama, I think that some of the initial rhetoric was very, very well received. His references in the State of the Union address and in the Al Arabiya TV interview to wanting to deal with Iran on the basis of mutual respect. I couldn't have written that phrase better myself in terms of a phrase that the Iranians would want to hear. The Nowruz message was, I think, pretty well crafted in that regard. But increasingly, I think the Iranians are, that I talk with, are concerned that there is, in fact, no really new policy to back that up.
But wouldn't the Iranians know that the dominant view in the White House is to wait until after the election? Because there was a fear on this side that you could do nothing until after the election was done. Sort that out and then lay out. Wouldn't they know that's what the dominant view is in the White House? And they'd be able to work with that?
Yes, they are aware of that, and I think they are prepared. They haven't completely cut off possibilities for giving Obama the benefit of the doubt, and if good policy emerges, I think they could still respond. But even in terms of the nuclear initiative, what Solana is going to be authorized to tell Jalili when he sits down with him is going to be, the great new wrinkle in American policy is that the United States will show up for negotiations. Mm-hmm. There's nothing new in terms of the package that's on the table to be negotiated. We won't require suspension as a precondition, but we aren't going to be able to continue the talks for very long if you don't essentially agree to freeze your program. And the Iranians are looking at that and saying, what's really new here?
Mm-hmm. Azadeh, about the Khatami question?
Right. As far as the boycotting, I have definitely read and heard a lot about the fact that many of the those who consider themselves reformists or not in favor of the conservatives, they definitely regret. You feel that they regret the fact that they boycotted the elections in the 2005 rounds because of the results that they received and Ahmadinejad got elected. You don't hear much of that in the conservative media, but there's a lot of internal dialogue going back and forth, and it's pretty unique in that the emphasis on more on voting on the more liberal side rather than voting to exactly which candidate. So it's more Mousavi and Karoubi, but they don't really, at least as of like 3 weeks ago, they would try not to tell you which candidate you would vote for, but they would just ask you to at least vote because they would say it matters. And the 2005 elections was definitely an example.
Thank you.
Can I make a quick
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Ken.
about this President Obama issue in light of your question, and also how he's being received in Iran. We and the APPs, we deliberately did not ask about that. We don't identify our poll as an American poll because we feel that would bias the results. So we do it in a way, and asking about President Obama could somewhat alter the perception of people being asked. So we don't ask.
Do you have plans for other polls like this?
Hopefully.
Okay, interesting. Let me go to Taylor Marsh, and then in the very back of the room, and then we'll go right up here. I'm going to run Ben around. He's been too lazy.
Hello, this is for Ms. Pourzan. I would like to know what the reaction is to Mousavi's wife. She's been called in the press as Iran's Michelle Obama, and if you could just speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Iran's Michelle Obama. Does that help her or hurt her?
Well, Mrs. Zahra Rahnavard certainly has been in the news for a while, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, as of yesterday, it seems to me that many people say that Mousavi's popularity is really dependent on Mrs. Rahnavard, and particularly I've heard that a lot of younger people have started to really support her, and especially following one of the speeches that she had, because I don't know if you all know or not, but Mrs. Rahnavard doesn't necessarily have a pretty strong revolutionary background, and one of the accusations is that she used to wear mini skirts, and so they asked her that, and said what they asked her, so maybe your hijab isn't sincere, and she came back with a speech that I've heard is it's a pretty good speech, saying that, well, this actually means that it's my real belief, and I am actually the real Muslim because I changed my ways of life because I saw light, and so it's sort of implying that hijab should not be a mandatory matter, and so after that, especially many have been supporting her and Mousavi as a result, and I've heard that, and you could see on TV they sometimes hold hands, which is very, very new in Iranian politics. So yeah.
Obama-esque. In the very back, we're blinded up here by light, so my apologies if I don't see just everyone in there. Is that Paul?
Yeah, Paul Martin with Peace Action.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Steve and Patrick, for another fabulous forum. Two things I haven't heard. One, how are these candidates being chosen? No one's talking about that. You need to have the nod from the Supreme Leader Khomeini. So is the deck stacked? And the second question is, there was definitely funding in the past administration for covert ops for regime change in this country. What's going on with that now, and how does that affect the election?
Interesting. Who would like to take either?
Look, there's always an issue about the Guardian Council's role in vetting candidates, not just for the presidential election, but also for parliamentary elections, and that's one of the aspects of the Iranian system that raises questions, at least for Westerners coming from a more liberal tradition about just how democratic is the system. But I still come back to the basic point that I made, which is, in a lot of Iranian elections, we don't know who's going to win until they actually hold them. And so, while there is the potential for blocking certain types of candidates because of the role that the Guardian Council plays, there is still a good deal of genuine electoral competition that goes on in Iran.
Just if I can, Kareem Sajadpour at the Carnegie Endowment, a good friend of ours, made the comment that about the Guardian Council in review says unfair, unfree, unpredictable.
Yeah, unfree, unfair, unpredictable. Yeah, and I really underscore the unpredictable part. In terms of what the U.S. is doing, this is something that I've raised in my critique of the Obama administration. I mean, certainly the Iranian perception is that there has been no reduction in repudiation of U.S. support for various types of destabilizing activities inside Iran. I suspect the Iranian definition of destabilizing activities is a little more expansive than the United States would use. But, I think it has been credibly reported that there was a finding signed during the second Bush term to support these activities, and there's certainly been no indication from the Obama administration that there's been any change in U.S. policy on that front.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right here.
Thank you. I'm Al Richmond, former State Department. I have a brief comment and a question. I hope, Ken, you have a chance to get into the field again, because recent polls, as reported in Wikipedia, Encyclopedia, show a tightening of the race. There are about half a dozen polls reported. I'm not familiar with them, but even those who show President Ahmadinejad way in the lead have tightened. To Flint, I would ask, even though all candidates would face some common strategic situations, you did mention that one of those, of course, is the degree of rapprochement with the U.S. And what I cannot help but feel, listening to the candidates, is that they would approach the U.S. in different ways. And that, for example, President Ahmadinejad, he not only talks about respect, he talks about justice. What does justice mean? Does it mean the U.S. dissociating itself from Israel, for example?
Well, let me first answer his comment.
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
I think what our poll, it's hard to comment on the other one, but what our poll found was that of the 27% who said they didn't know, 60% of those were favoring reform and more democracy in Iran, et cetera, open elections. So it would be, I would think, a fair assumption that most of those voters would not go in the Ahmadinejad camp. So I do think, even when we took the polls, it was a lot tighter than those, the kind of top-line numbers or the first glance at them would reveal.
Flint, quick response?
Yeah, as I said, I think there are going to be some stylistic differences, but I think in terms of, the parameters of a grand bargain or a strategic understanding with the United States that would ultimately be acceptable with Tehran, in Tehran, at the level of this elite consensus in the Supreme National Security Council, I don't think it's going to vary that much depending on who the president is. The issue will be one of style. The issue may be one of, the United States would probably rather be dealing with a Mousavi than an Ahmadinejad, if not on substantive grounds, at least just because Ahmadinejad is perceived as so politically allergic here because of some of his rhetoric about Israel. But I don't think in terms of what Iran would actually be willing to sign off on the nuclear issue, what it would actually be willing to sign off on various aspects of regional security, I don't think the bottom line is going to be that different with a President Ahmadinejad or President Mousavi.
Thank you. Yes.
Andy Klingenstein, I'm on the board of Terra Free Tomorrow. I'm interested in going back to the poll finding that said that 70% of the people would exchange offensive nuclear weapons for investment / foreign aid. First question, Ken, is that consistent with, or has it moved from the last time you polled on that question? And secondly, to Flint, is that finding, do you think, entirely consistent with what you talked about as the foreign policy elite? Because when you discuss this exchange, you add the element of security unless you translate further aid and trade to security in and of itself.
Yeah, it is consistent. That's what we've been finding over the past. So this is the third poll over the past 2 years.
No change, same
it's
numbers.
Basically the same.
Interesting. Flint?
Yeah, I would suspect that when people are asked about, would you be willing to, accept, pretty strong limits on the possibility of Iran getting nuclear weapons in return for all these various things, whether it's trade, aid, investment, I would suspect for most Iranians that means a kind of a grand bargain with the United States in which the sorts of security concerns that the elite would have, namely that the United States be making a pretty strong commitment not to try to change the borders or form of government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, would recognize that Iran has a legitimate regional role, and would come to some common understanding of what that role is. I don't think there's a great divide between the public or between what I see as the elite consensus and what Ken is describing as the public attitude.
Great, thank you. Diane Perlman, and then right. Did you have your hand up? Yep, and then right over here.
Diane Perlman, Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, George Mason University. First of all, Flint, I always appreciate your formulation of things. And I agree that Obama sort of has the same position of, we must not let Iran get nuclear weapons and willing to use punitive, coercive techniques and sanctions.
Yeah, but at least his sentence is parsed.
Right. No, he's much nicer and with a smile.
We have 6 minutes. So
okay, but I would say according to conflict analysis that, you can predict that it could more likely to provoke defiance and breakdown, and the more we pressure them, the stronger will be the desire. How much is anybody listening to you in terms of the grand bargain, and are there a way that in the Obama administration?
I think they liked the line because they began using the line.
And also who won the debates. So.
Okay.
In terms of who's listening, well, I'll keep my private conversations private, but I think there is, to some degree, a debate going on within the administration. I think, on balance, those who would argue for the need for a comprehensive approach to Iran, I still think in the interagency process they are outnumbered by the more incremental point of view. I think you have a Secretary of State who's not supporting a grand bargain. I think you have a Secretary of Defense who, though I think he kept the Bush administration from going off the deep end on Iran during its second term, he has said publicly, since Obama became president, he doesn't think a grand bargain's in the works or should be. I think if Obama wants to do this, if he really wants a Nixon to China sort of achievement with Iran, he's going to have to make it happen. And I have not seen him proceeding either bureaucratically or politically in a way that gives me a lot of confidence that this is going to be such a priority for him that he will insist on something different. I'd love to be proved wrong on that, but
I still hold out hope. I mean, one of the really interesting things about Barack Obama that I wrote about before the election and after the election was that this guy has the conceit and the self-confidence that he believes he is his own national security advisor. And I've seen on other issues, on Cuba and others, how after listening to the people who are ostensibly his advocates, ambassadors, spear carriers on policy, who were so out of line with where he ended up, that it almost is as if Jim Jones is a process guy. I think Bob Gates is more pushable on this than you may think. But that ultimately, Obama may be letting everybody play out their drama and then setting forth what the cast will be. I could be wrong as well, but I've seen other cases where Obama was his own national security advisor and direction after getting everybody to play. So
when did we lift the Cuba embargo?
Well, we didn't, but the point was when the ambassador responsible for that meeting of the Summit of the Americas gave zero indication, wanted Cuba not to even come up in the OAS meeting, said that, and gave essentially the neoconservative response on human rights and prisoners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then what limited action we did get on the OAS essentially vetoed what his own people, were saying. So look, I don't want to be engaged. I'm not a sentimentalist hoping for hope, but I am saying structurally you see something different in this president than you've seen in other presidents, and I think it's probably a mistake because I think you end up with a team that doesn't know where its leader is going.
Yeah.
But you do see cases, and I have seen cases where Barack Obama set the cast for other people who may not have agreed with them after letting the drama among them play out.
The comparison I draw is with Nixon in China, where Nixon came in with a very, very well-developed strategic vision which put an opening to China as a high priority for his foreign policy.
Right.
He then proceeded basically to rewrite 25 years of American policy towards China with just 3 or 4 people working for him directly at the White House, and the Secretary of State was informed very late in the day that there are going to be some changes in our China policy. I don't see Obama. I mean, it is interesting that on a lot of issues, and Cuba may be one of them, the best, the most forward-leaning strategic impulses come from the president, not from anybody on his senior team. But they're just that. They're impulses. They're not well-developed strategic visions, and I don't know if he really has what it's going to take in the end to make the really decisive strategic decisions that could take U.S. policy in a fundamentally different direction over the objections of important members of his senior apparatus. But we'll see.
I agree with that. I think we have a class that's about to run out. If I can ask you to keep your heads down below the cameras and leave quietly, feel free to just step out because we have a camera. But I want to go to this lady here and this gentleman, and we'll just take both of your questions together and then wrap up. And I want to thank Dan, keep your head down. And I want to thank Wayne Glass, my former colleague with Senator Bingham's office, who's teaching at the University of Southern California, and his excellent students. But yes, ma'am.
My first question is for Flint.
We're going to make it very brief if we can.
Well, I have 2 questions. What is the single most important question that Obama faces with regards to Iran? And the question you said he has to put on the discussion table with Iran, what would you suggest that would be? And with Mr. Bollert, among the people that you have chosen for the poll, 1,001 person among 70 million people, how do you choose them? And because 62% of them in a country which is 30% are below the poverty level, they have supported 62% to support Hezbollah financially. How do you choose those people?
Thank you. And this gentleman right here.
Walt Cutler, very specific question. Did I understand you correctly that Mousavi does not have particular support among the Azeris? If that's true, why?
Thank you, Ambassador Cutler. So, Ken, why don't we start with you?
To answer the ambassador's question first, that's correct. I don't know why. And maybe Azadeh can comment on that. I'm not sure why that appeal, at least at the time of our poll, was not really connecting with the Azari people. I mean, I don't know whether you wanted to add. And just briefly, we choose the people like any public opinion survey here in the United States. It's done randomly, so we get a random national sample, and it's done through proven methodology along those lines. Go ahead.
I don't really have a very clear answer for that either, but based on, again, what I hear and read in the media, it seems that the issue that they tend to emphasize the most is that if he gets elected, he will be the first Azeri president of Iran. So it's actually, they don't really talk about the voters and, or the context within, like, Tabriz or Urumiyeh or the 2 Azerbaijans or the Turkish population in Iran or in Tehran, how exactly they're planning to vote. But the emphasis is on the success and if he succeeds.
Thank you. Flint, final comments?
The question Obama needs to ask himself or ask his senior national security team is, are we really interested in solving the fundamental strategic differences between the United States and Iran, or are we just, in the end, really interested in, managing these issues? And then in terms of what he needs, what I recommend he ask the Iranians is, I would recommend that he ask the Iranians, I want to move toward a normal relationship with you, with this very important and strategically significant country. What is it that you need in order to make rapprochement, a strategic opening, a normal relationship between our countries? What is it that you would need in order to make that possible? I have some ideas about what you might need, but why don't I just hear it from you directly?
I want to thank all 3 of our panelists, Ken Ballin, Azadeh Pourzan, Flint Leverett, and also want to highlight for those here and those online that the CNN Iran.com has a new article that has appeared in the last few minutes, written by Ken Ballin and Amjad Atala. Amjad is with the New American Foundation, with a different headline. The headline is Commentary, Iranians Favor Peace Deal with the United States, as opposed to the Associated Press, which poll few Iranians see U.S. favorably despite Obama. So there we have our form of think tank and public intellectual debate and democracy. But thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Are you still at Harvard right now?